really need to get a camera though. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, Bean here, and today I'm going to be bringing you a video that's a little bit different from what I normally do, or what we normally do here on the channel, and I've wanted to touch on something that I'm pretty passionate about, and that is fantasy. Now, I read a lot of high fantasy books, and I kind of wanted to talk about the switch from YA fantasy to adult fantasy, because I am a big reader of adult fantasy stories. So this video is going to be kind of me talking about some of the books that I would recommend using as transition books, or some of the authors that I would use as transition authors, because I have a list of several of them, and I'm going to show you several books along the way. My room is a nice mess right now, full of books, all sorts of things, all over the place, basically. All of the extra worlds, all over. So I'm going to just jump right into it, but what I'm going to start with is I'm going to start with YA. So YA fantasy is basically the idea of tropes. In my opinion, that's where I get a lot of the tropes. One of the most well-known YA fantasy series is Fallen Kingdoms by Morgan Rhodes. I would consider this to be kind of the epitome, kind of like the whole idea of YA fantasy. This book, while it's chock full of tropes, it is a wonderful example of YA fantasy. It has the princess, it has the princess, it has a rebel, it has a sorceress, and it has an heir, and it's got all of the right characters, all of the building blocks, including the fact that it's, 6 books long, which really plays into that fantasy idea. One of the big things that we talk about with fantasy is that the authors have to build these worlds, and they build these worlds up, and so the series end up being pretty long. So I believe the majority of the series that I'm going to talk about today are pretty long, lengthy series. Not all of them are, but I definitely would consider Fallen Kingdoms to be one of the big ones that I highly recommend for people. And kind of along with those, I'm going to bring up 2 more series that I recommend reading, especially if you're looking to get into any sort of fantasy. One of the other series that I highly recommend is actually considered a middle grade, and it's considered a middle grade for the first several books, and then it switches into YA, and that's going to be your Harry Potter series. I know that we talk about this series a lot, but the thing is, it really deserves to be talked about a lot, because it is the epitome of what we all want in a magical story, and that is another big aspect of fantasy stories, is magic. So you have the royalty, or you have the magic systems, you have the creatures that you don't actually know what they are, or they're unique to this world, or they're dragons, so you automatically associate them with a fantastical world. So I would highly recommend Harry Potter as another series to definitely work yourself into, especially because this one draws a lot from the world that we live in. So there are aspects of this that are familiar. So this is going to be a little bit lighter on the fantasy side. But obviously this is about a magical school. So there's a lot of magic and a lot of fantasy in it in that sort of way. And not to mention, this is another great transition book, because as the series go on, the books get darker and darker, and just more and more intense as far as the story, as far as the seriousness of the magic and the consequences that Harry and his friends end up dealing with due to this magic. So this is another one I would highly recommend. Moving on to actually probably my favorite book, and I'm actually going to talk about this one for a little bit longer, and that's because this is going to be Wild Magic by Tamora Pierce. The reason I'm going to talk about this one is because this is pretty much the epitome of what I consider to be a fantastical story. Wild Magic is the first book in a 4-book series. That series is called The Immortals Quartet. Now, that series takes place in a world, and this world is called Tortal. Now, because Tamora Pierce has created this world, this isn't the only series she has. I believe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I believe there are 6 series that she has created that are set in this world. She also has some companion novels like The Spy Master. And so she's taken a world that she has created that has magic, that has these magical creatures, that has the monarchy, that has all of this, and she has created a world that she's able to follow different characters in different timelines through this world because it is solely created in her mind and she's able to show that out. I think that is probably one of the biggest parts of fantasy, is that this is a whole separate world. This isn't our world. This is set in like a medieval sort of version of our world, but there's magic and there's dragons and there's centaurs and there's made up creatures like stormwings that she makes up and spydrons, and it just keeps going, and it's all about the magic system and it's all about court life and all of this kind of stuff. So this is a series, this is a world, really, that I highly recommend. I do recommend you either start with this series, the Immortal series, or you start with the Alanna series, which is another series that is also 4 books long, but follows a different character, who actually does make an appearance in this book as well. So that's kind of how I associate the different sort of worlds that authors will create for fantasy novels. All right, switching gears a little bit, I'm going to switch into a couple series that I recommend as transition series. So I'm going to do transition series first, and then I'm going to move on to transition authors, and I'll explain that when I get there. But as far as the series go, I have 3 here that I am going to talk about. The first one being one that I have not yet finished, but I am very excited to, and that is the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. One of the main reasons that I highly recommend Brandon Sanderson's work is because he is so good at world building and immersing you into this world and the magic and the people that I feel like I'm being sucked right into this world and I can't escape it. Brandon Sanderson's work has really been going around BookTube a lot as of late, and I haven't read any of his adult fantasy books, which actually this one's probably considered an adult fantasy, but I haven't read any of the longer books of his, but I have really only heard very good things, especially if you like fantasy. So once you've gotten through some of the more YA fantasy books, and it's not just the ones that I mentioned, there's a whole bunch of others that I highly recommend, but then I'd suggest moving on to a series like Mistborn. Something that you might start noticing when it comes to these transition books is that there is one main character who is the hero of the story. And so because there is this one hero, you're able to follow them and explore the world with them. And so that is one thing that really helps to figure out the stories and figure out how these worlds are being developed. So highly recommend this one. The second series is going to be another one that's really well known, and this one I kind of grouped with the Tamora Pierce books that I've read, and that's Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. I have no idea how many series she has written in this world, but they're wonderful, and she has written all these different series that intersect in the same or different timelines, all that take place in this world that she has created. So again, it's following different characters in the same world because Robin Hobb has spent enough time creating this world that she found other characters that she wanted to write about, and so she did. And I think that's one of the amazing things about a lot of the fantasy books that we read, is that there's this huge world that these authors take advantage of and they just run with it, and I love it. It's amazing. So this is another series that I highly recommend. There are dragons in this one, so there. It's been a really long time since I've read Assassin's Apprentice, and this is an old book, so I really need to get back into it. And then the next one that I'm going to recommend is one that actually was probably one of the first adult fantasies that I read, and that is the Abhorsen Chronicles by Garth Nix. This includes 4 books, which is Sabriel, Lyriel, and Abhorsen. Hey guys, Editing Bean here. And so I know that I said there are 4 books in the Abhorsen Chronicles. There's actually 5. So it's Sabriel, Lyriel, Abhorsen, Clariel, and Golden Hand. And then there's 2 short story collections. So fail. Now, This is a very big book, but that's because this is all 3 of them in one. Because I could, honestly, and because I really love this symbol and I love this cover a lot more than anything else. Oh my goodness. But it's heavy. So that kind of brings me into my next thing with high fantasy books, is that they are stereotypically huge. And some of them are. Some of them are beasts of books, and others of them really just aren't. So the reason that I bring up Garth Nix is actually he's going to be a perfect example for the next group that I'm going to be talking about. Garth Nix is what I would call a transition author. And the reason I say that is because he writes books that are in middle grade, YA, and adult books. Mostly, I believe he writes mostly middle grade and adult, but he writes fantasy for all ages. So you're able to familiarize yourself with his writing at the middle grade level. For example, with his book Frogkisser? Something like that. I'll put a picture up here. But, and then you can read something like this, the Abhorsen Chronicles, which is going to be very high fantasy. This is a very different world. It doesn't really follow the rules of our world at all. And the magic takes a little adjusting to because it's not something that you're used to. It's done with bells instead. So it's very different, very interesting, but it's very well done again. The next transition author that I'm going to talk about is going to be Jay Kristoff. And now I have books from all of his series except for the first one I want to talk about, which is Illuminae by Jay Kristoff and Amie Kaufman. Now, this is a YA fantasy. YA fantasy / science fiction almost. This one has artificial intelligence, so it is more of a sci-fi than it is a fantasy. But I want to talk about Jay Kristoff because his next book is also a fantasy, but that series is the Aurora Rising series. And again, by Jay Kristoff and Amie Kaufman, they kind of move it up a little bit. So Illuminae is like your complete YA. And then it comes to Aurora Burning, which is more new adult than YA. There's more going on in this series so far that is emotionally detrimental as compared to the first one, as compared to the Illuminae files, at least for me, but we'll see what happens. The next series by Jay Kristoff that I recommend is Stormdancer. Now, Stormdancer is actually the first series I ever read by Jay Kristoff. This is just by him, and this is a solid steampunk fantasy series. Yes, that's what I said. So the reason that I put this one a little bit higher is that this one has much more violence in it. This one, well, yes, if you've read Illuminae, there's a lot of violence in that one. I understand. This one has a lot more blood, guts, and gore. This one has a lot more violence that the main characters are causing, and they're causing it on purpose. She's looking to try and save her family from this emperor. But this book introduces things such as demons and winged creatures. Like this creature right here is actually a thing. He's a griffin, so we like griffins. But it introduces the companionship between a familiar or an animal companion and a human being. There's much more violence. It's much more adult themed than his past books are, and it just keeps playing like that. This is a trilogy, so it is a solidly length series as well. And then the last series that I'm going to talk about by Jay Kristoff is, of course, the Nevernight series, the Nevernight Chronicles. Now, this one is a complete adult fantasy, and while I absolutely love this series, I do not recommend jumping into it if you've never read a fantasy before, if you've never read an adult fantasy before, because this series has a lot of adult moments in it, and that could be anything from sexual violence or sexual scenes to increased just violence for the sake of violence, or complex concepts, betrayals, murders. All of this kind of stuff really makes it into much more of an adult story, and into really a story that's kind of scary at points. And it's hard to understand at points if your head isn't able to comprehend that. And that's not saying that you're not intelligent. It might just be that you haven't been exposed to it before. So I really do think that this is a book that once you have gotten into the fantasy genre is something that I would recommend reading. The next author that I'm going to talk about is V.E. Schwab, or Victoria Schwab, as she is known for her YA novels, such as This Savage Song, which is a duology by Victoria Schwab. This is a YA series that deals with demons and music and knowing when you're a monster and when you're not. So this is this one follows younger characters. It is, I don't want to say it's a sweet story, because it's not a sweet story. None of V.E. Schwab's writing is sweet, I wouldn't call it, but there is romance in it. She writes wonderful romance books as well. Well, romance in fantasy books, with the stabby stabs. So, yeah, this is definitely one that starts YA, and then you can move on from this one into the Darker Shade of Magic series by V.E. Schwab. Same author, just different way of writing it. It's how she differentiates between her adult and YA books. So V.E. Schwab does the adult books, and A Darker Shade of Magic is 3 books long. They get longer as they go. Oh, they're right here. They're right there. But these are much more complicated stories. Again, more adult themes. A lot more about politics as well. It tends to get more into politics the more adult you get as well, because you don't take things for granted in the adult fantasy world nearly as much as they do in YA. And the last author that I'm going to talk about is one that is very familiar to us again, and that is going to be Sarah J. Maas. And I'm going to start with Throne of Glass, which I am now starting to read, which I have read this one before a long time ago, really enjoyed it. This is a fantasy story. This is a YA story. There are tropes galore. Take it and run with it. It is a great story. And then you move on to her most recent release, which is House of Earth and Blood, in the Crescent City series. This book, I have feelings, which I will get into in my recent reads, but this book was much more intense. I won't say there's more blood, guts, and gore, but it felt more like the blood, guts, and gore were more heart-wrenching almost, were more violent at a lot of points. They weren't explained away by the fact that she's an assassin. No, she's really good at what she does, but it's not because she's an assassin, because in this story, Bryce is not an assassin. She's just not. But this one also has the magical creatures. It has angels. It has ghosts. It has magic. It's got all of this kinds of stuff. It has werewolves, which make me very happy. I love werewolves. Yeah, no, this one is definitely adult. I would recommend, again, the reason that I'm doing these author recommendations is so that way you can read books in YA that are still good. And there's nothing wrong with reading YA. Okay, I want to tackle this really quickly here because this has been an issue that I have run into several times. I am in my late 20s. I don't act like it ever because that's just who I am. But I read YA, and that's okay. There is absolutely nothing wrong with adults reading YA novels, okay? Just because they're YA doesn't mean that an adult can't read them. And just because a book is adult doesn't mean a young adult can't read them either. So I wanted to get that out of the way because I'm sure I would have had a comment about that otherwise, and I just don't take me there. Just don't. It's not something that I really want to discuss. That's how I feel, and I know everybody has their own feelings on that. YA can bring you a lot of different stories. It can bring you lots of lessons that you might not get in some of the adult books. It can bring you a peace of mind at points too, where it's like, you know what? There can be a happy ending. And then adult books can bring you either the reality or another kind of, hey, look, magic, happy endings, we're good, whatever. But it doesn't matter if it's YA or adult. It can be great stories. The reason that I'm showing you authors that write both is so that way when you're transitioning from one to the other, you're familiar with the writing style. And that's something I really didn't mention, and I should have earlier. But the reason that all of these authors are ones that I highly recommend is because their writing style is their writing style. It doesn't change a considerable amount when it shifts from YA or new adult to adult style novels. You're able to have some sort of familiarity there, so that way you can go into these stories feeling a little bit more comfortable, rather than trying to digest the author's way of speaking, the author's way of explaining things, and then being confused about everything. But these are the top 3 authors that I came up with that have done both YA fantasy and adult fantasy, and in my opinion at least, have done both of them very well. So I would love to hear any other authors that you recommend for that, but I am going to talk about 2 more authors right now that are going to be books that are complete fantasy, complete adult fantasy, and I don't highly recommend you to read, that I wouldn't recommend you read if you haven't touched fantasy before, and these are going to be more controversial. You'll know why in a second. The first one I'm going to talk about is Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. Okay, I had seen a picture online where someone took all of the currently published Game of Thrones books and marked each page that a character died. I don't know why this struck me so much, but there were so many tabs in all of the books, it's ridiculous. Like, this series is full of incest, it's full of rape, murder, revenge, betrayal, dragons eating people, setting things on fire. It's intense. This is not a book I recommend if you're not ready for that. And if you're not, that's okay. I promise it's okay. So that is a thing that I think, since we have the Game of Thrones show, which I watched the first season, it's not my thing, but that's okay. It might be your thing. I know Callie loved it. So good for you guys if you love it. But the books aren't exactly like the show. The books, for one, are a lot longer and a little bit more boring. I'm not gonna lie, that sounds terrible coming from me who loves fantasy and who has read this book, and actually who read it in one sitting. But that is the other thing with this book, is that each chapter is told from a different perspective, and you have to be able to adapt to that. And remember everybody's name is the hardest part, I swear. I swear, that's the hardest part of most fantasy books, is remembering and figuring out how to pronounce people's names. That brings me to my next series. Now, I have 2 books here. I'm just going to show them. The Hobbit and The Fellowship of the Ring, both by J.R.R. Tolkien. We're going to talk about The Hobbit first, because The Hobbit is a book that I actually read when I was younger, and I'm glad I did. It was a good story, and it's actually one that I would treat as a bit of a bedtime story. Like, I would definitely use this as a bedtime story. I would not use the movies as a bedtime story, but I would use the book as a bedtime story. That being said, The Fellowship of the Ring, I would not use as a bedtime story. This book, people have some issues with J.R.R. Tolkien's writing, and the reason for that is because he can take 20 pages to describe a tree. That's how he writes. You have to get used to that, and there isn't really another way for him to do it. I love his writing. I love the descriptions. I love how it goes, because you get sucked into the story, and I love that. However, it's not for everybody. And the reason that I have these 3 books here is that they're not for everybody. All of these books, in fact, really aren't going to be for everybody. These are my personal favorites. And these are the books that I am recommending to you if you're going to be switching from YA to adult fantasy books, and kind of my direction on how I would do that. So, kind of as a recap, since I know this is a pretty long video, I hope you had a good snack and a good cup of tea or coffee or something. But oh, my AC turned on. But to recap, in general, I would recommend finding an author or a type of genre that you are going to stick with through this process of switching from one to the other, because it can be a bit rough, because there are such differences in voices between the YA and the adult series. If you can find the new adult series, go for it. I find that new adult is hit and miss because there tends to be a lot of sexy time stuff, and that's just not something that I enjoy reading about nearly as much, so that's just not up my alley. But if that's something that helps you, go for it. Whatever. But yeah, I think that's about what I'm going to talk about here today. I really hope this video makes sense. I'm going to be really sad if it doesn't, and maybe I'll try it again another time. But I hope this made sense to you guys. So please let me know what you think down below. Be nice. And if you enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. We post videos every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. And if you want to be reminded when we post these videos, hit the little bell icon down below. If you go down in the description, I'll list all of the books that I have talked about here today. And also listed down below will be our Goodreads, Instagram, and blog links. So feel free to check us all out there. And I hope you guys have a great time. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you later. Bye!